For me, travel is not movement. For me, travel is standing still at a new geographical location and letting myself absorb everything that is around me, everything that is new around me, the people, the language, the smell, the sounds. Travel is an exploration of a different culture, but the exploration through absorption rather than a constant movement. Welcome to today's episode of On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. My name is Laura Sagan, and I'm your host and a fellow human being. Today, this episode is being recorded in Guatemala in a small town called San Marcos. So if you hear strange noises on the background, it's probably roosters, dogs barking, traffic, or construction noise. So for this heads up, I'm excited to proceed to our today's topic. It is about travel, what travel is and why travel is important. I love how small travel makes me feel. I love how small it makes me realize my life, in my daily life in Amsterdam really is. It invites the expansion of the mind. It invites the expansion of the consciousness of me being part of something so much bigger than I am, being part of something so much bigger that my life is the Netherlands, or how small the Netherlands really is, or any other country on its own, any other continent. It invites the expansion of awareness of just what constitutes life, just by being able to absorb the culture for a little while and appreciate all its intricacies in their fullness, or to an extent of fullness that I can afford at a time. It is an experience that is always in my budget. I may not be willing to purchase an expensive designer bag, but I am willing to drop the same amount of money on travel and the exploration of a new culture. And I'm very fortunate to be able to stand still for a while at a location I'm arriving. So arriving somewhere and standing there, for example, for 2-3 days to just sink in before I start exploring. I don't consider a weekend in Rome as a way to understand what is it like to be in Italy. I don't consider even a month living in Italy as a way to understand what constitutes being an Italian. And this is just a small little seed, a small glimpse of experience for me to understand what constitutes a different culture, a different way of living. I personally try to learn a few phrases before I arrive, or when I arrive, if it's a language that I don't speak, to be able to capture the feeling behind the language and to capture the feeling behind the culture. Because in another episode, I talk about the language and culture are so tightly linked. It's kind of a feeding loop, is that the language dictates culture and how people communicate and relate to each other. And language dictates culture. So whichever tool that you use every day is going to define your life. And however you define your life through the actions that you take is going to dictate how you communicate with one another, which is why it's so useful to understand at least the logic behind the language of a country that you're traveling to. Another thing that I love doing when I'm traveling is, like I mentioned, standing still somewhere for a little while. So I don't like weekend getaways to a different country that I haven't been before, because personally I get overwhelmed by all the stimuli, all the perception of different things, the tapestry of different things I'm surrounded by when something needs to be squeezed in one weekend. How can I ever appreciate the beauty of Athens, the history, the rich history behind that city in just a weekend? I cannot, and I surely cannot comprehend the entire Greek culture, the rich history, the culture, the food, the experience of what is it like to be Greek. Even in 2 weeks that I spent there, it just wasn't enough. And that is another thing, another way that I look at travel is when I'm traveling somewhere, I already appreciate that I would never be able to fully comprehend of what is it like to live in that country, what is it like to belong to that land. I almost appreciate and I welcome the inherent failure of my attempt to comprehend the culture by merely traveling to that location. I was fortunate enough to live in different countries, and it took me years to understand what is it like to be British when I was living in the United Kingdom. It took me years to understand what does it take to be a Dutch person, what is a Dutch culture is, even though I'm living there right now for the last 6 years. There's still certain things that surprise me, and there's still things for me to discover. So when I go to a new location, I know I would never be able to comprehend the entirety of the richness of the culture behind the place that I'm visiting. So these days, when I was traveling to Guatemala, for example, I bought a book, a guidebook, and I barely opened it because I stayed in this little village. And I learned about cacao as plant medicine as part of the Mayan culture. I learned about the Mayan cosmology and the calendar. I communicated with locals. I talked to people who lived here for a while. And I just was in the space of observing. And whenever I would open this guidebook, it would just be mind-boggling of how many things I'm missing out upon. And then someone asked me if I went to these waterfalls called Samokchapni, and it's located in Guatemala. It's a few hours drive, and it's one of the things that is on the things to do list. And I replied that it's something that I'm willing to skip, even though I'm here for 2 months. There are certain things that I'm okay skipping because I prioritize different things, different experiences. And if I am to go there, I would go there for taking a picture, to seeing another waterfall. But there are certain things that it's okay to miss in order to really absorb the culture that you're in. So it's important to ask yourself as to why you're traveling. If you're traveling to take a picture, then it's a completely valid reason. If that is your goal, fully respect it, fully acknowledge it, and that is completely okay. If your goal is to understand culture, if your goal is to understand people and enrich your life through it, then it's a different story. It requires a different pace of travel. It requires a different type of research before you head out to that country, and appreciating the fact that you will never understand the entire culture just by spending there a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, or even 6 months. Sometimes in countries like India, I know that if I am to live there for a year, I may begin to scratch the surface around certain things, but it would never be possible for me to understand and to comprehend and really truly feel the beauty behind the Indian culture. All that multifaceted patchwork that India is. I can sing an ode to India. It's one of my favorite destinations to visit, and I keep coming back there. And that's another aspect of traveling, is that when I discover a certain place, sometimes I know that I will be back. Sometimes I know that this is not the last time I'm there. And that is another thing, is that of course there is always a risk that I die without ever coming back to that place. But to allow myself that possibility of not seeing everything and not feeling like I am missing out on certain things by not having gone somewhere, by not taking that picture next to that statue or that site, it's okay. I make it okay for me. And travel for me, as like I shared in the beginning of the episode, is the absorption of a different culture. Now, certain things that I wanted to mention is budget travel. Because sometimes when I traveled on a slightly larger budget and I was able to eat out more frequently, I felt more detached from the culture that I was trying to absorb. Whereas compared, this thought came to me actually when I was at the back of the bus, right? When that was taking me from a train station in India, in Kerala, to take me to an ashram. And it was one of those bus rides in this country roads that is really bumpy, and people were having random things around me. There was no AC on the bus. And I realized at that exact moment is that I'm able to understand what is it like to live in India for quote unquote normal person, for a person with an average income, for a person who needs to take a bus every day, that I'm able to absorb the culture by traveling on a budget, by not, first of all, it's budget friendly, of course, it's very good for your wallet to travel it, but it also allows you to absorb and observe the culture as it truly is for locals. The locals don't eat out at restaurants every day. They don't stay in fancy hotels. So if you do have an opportunity to stay with a host, and if your host is your friend who lived in the country for a while or someone that you know from a country, it's one of the best ways to absorb the culture that you're exploring is to staying with the local, or at least having a local contact somewhere who can show you little different things, little different secret locations that are not covered in the guides. So even if they are covered in the guides, the way and the feeling that they're able to convey to you when they're showing it to you, it's going to be entirely different. Another aspect that I invite you to explore is cooking for yourself when you're traveling. It could be quite annoying because the other day I was making a dish for someone and I realized I need oil, I need spices, I need salt, I need all those things. And I have a kitchen in the place that I'm staying in Guatemala. And it kind of like realized me all those different things that I need to get. And with that, it invited me to speak to someone I knew locally here, to ask them for spices because I didn't want to buy a jar of cumin or a jar of paprika because it would be a waste. I have onwards travel to do. But it also invited me to go and explore the food markets, the actual farmers market, to go and buy fruits and vegetables there and to understand what is on offer, to explore different fruits and vegetables that are being offered in the markets, to explore the ways that people are cooking, to invite this kind of slow exploration rather than you go out to the restaurant and you have this local dish that, maybe it's a traditional dish. And of course, it invites the exploration. For me, exploration of a different culture is impossible, absolutely impossible without trying local cuisine, especially street food. I love street food. And people say, well, you might get food poisoning. Yes, sometimes you might. In India, when I traveled, I did not, I think in my memory, I got food poisoning once on a train. And that was the only time, really. So you're kind of like, if you're staying at a country where you're kind of worried about the bacteria you might consume, so I would say go slowly. So for example, don't start with eating meat because that's the one type of food that tend to contain more bacteria and it might trigger your system a little bit more. But start slowly, start that exploration of food slowly and try cooking. If you're staying somewhere for longer, so if you're standing still in one village or in one town and you have access to a kitchen, I invite you to cook. I invite you to cook because it also will help you feel more at home at that location, because we're cooking at home. We tend to cook more at home. And that would invite a different feeling, a different experience of you being in a different country. And that feeling of home and how beautiful it is to feel at home at a different location. It is such a simple thing, such a simple realization that I had. Even if you're cooking something that isn't local, you're not trying to cook a local dish. You could be cooking a pasta dish that you normally cook at home, but the feeling it would evoke in you, the feeling of home, would make you appreciate the space that you're in and make you appreciate it more as a home than you were before, than if you were to eat out in the restaurant. So the next time you're traveling, I invite you to stay with someone you know, or at least have a contact to show you around locally if you can, and to cook for yourself. And if you have an opportunity to stay somewhere longer to appreciate the culture, do that. I thank you for your time and attention to listen to this episode of On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. I'm Laura Sagan, your host. If you have any suggestions on topics that you'd like me to cover, any questions, any thoughts and feelings you'd like to share, I invite you to do so in the comment section on the YouTube channel. You can share those with me on Instagram. The handle is On Emergence. or connect with me through the website on emergence.com. I will speak to you soon.